Every member world gets representation in the Senate. No single planet rules over another. Disputes get settled through debate, not warfare. That was the promise. Somewhere between 25,000 and 20,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, representatives from dozens of core worlds gathered to establish what they called a democratic federal union. Thousands of senators representing member worlds would settle their differences through civilized discourse, rather than the blaster fire that had characterized the lawless millennia before. It was elegant. It was inspiring. It was the kind of idealistic vision that makes species who have never trusted outsiders suddenly believe that perhaps this time, this institution, this galaxy-spanning experiment might actually work. Here's what actually happened. The architecture of Coruscant told the truth that the founding documents lied about. While the Senate Dome would eventually rise as a monument to egalitarian governance, those famous floating platforms giving the visual impression that every senator hovered at equal height, the planet beneath that dome was constructing something else entirely. A vertical hierarchy so literal it required no interpretation. Coruscant's urban layers extended downward through more than 5,127 distinct levels. Each one represented a stratum of wealth, power, and social standing that corresponded directly to altitude. The wealthiest citizens, the galactic elites, the government officials, they resided on level 5,127 and above, in skyscrapers that scraped the very top of the breathable atmosphere. The message was encoded in duracrete and transparisteel, impossible to miss. In the capital of this supposed democracy, your literal elevation determined your worth. The higher you lived, the more sunlight touched your windows, the cleaner your air, the more influence you wielded. This wasn't corruption seeping into a pure system. This was the system. And if you want to understand what the Republic would eventually do to the Outer Rim on a galactic scale, you only needed to look down, way down, to level 1,313 and the depths below it. Places described by those who survived them as a dungeon so deep that the world above forgot about it. The residents of these abyssal levels breathed air thick with toxic fumes accumulated over millennia of urbanization. They navigated through shattered conduits that no maintenance crew had visited in generations. They lived under the de facto governance of criminal gangs who had filled the vacuum left by an absent republic. The pollution that wealthy Coruscanti generated in their upper-level residences, it drifted downward, settled in the lungs of populations the Senate would never see, never consider, never represent. The Republic didn't need to wait 24,000 years to reveal what it was. The proof was always there, rising 5,000 levels into the sky and plunging into darkness below. But the Senate chamber, oh, the Senate chamber was beautiful. Those floating platforms, each one hovering at the same height. The theater of democracy, the costume of equality. The reality was oligarchy dressed in fancy robes. Here's the thing about the Republic that most histories gloss over. Corporations, guilds, and businesses were eventually given direct representation in the Galactic Senate itself. The Trade Federation eventually sat alongside planetary delegations as a voting member of the supposed democracy. Not representing any planet, not accountable to any population, just there. A corporate entity with the same political standing as entire civilizations. And this wasn't a bug introduced by later corruption. This was a feature, requested by the core worlds, whose merchant classes understood something fundamental about power. Political authority and economic extraction could be merged into a single, seamless instrument. Why bother bribing senators when you could just become one? The Trade Federation controlled vast free trade zones where it laid down its own laws. It extorted enormous protection fees from independent traders. It forced anyone who wanted to do business in certain sectors to follow regulations designed not for fairness, but for crushing competition. All of this was legal. All of this was democratic. All of this was the Republic working exactly as its architects intended. Let me show you how the extraction worked in practice. An Outer Rim agricultural world wants to sell its harvest to core world markets. Seems simple enough. But that world faces a supply chain engineered to extract profit at every stage. Federation-affiliated shipping companies charge rates calibrated to the absence of competition, rates that the Republic's own military restrictions ensured would remain unchallenged. Federation-controlled communication networks charge premiums for access to market information that sellers on core worlds receive essentially for free. Federation-administered trading posts assess fees and tariffs that apply to Outer Rim goods, but mysteriously exempt core world exports heading in the opposite direction. By the time an Outer Rim farmer's grain reaches a core world table, the price the consumer pays has been divided among so many intermediaries that the farmer receives a fraction of the value his labor created. And if that farmer wants to complain, he can petition his senator, who will be outvoted by the Trade Federation's own representative sitting in that same chamber. The Senate didn't just permit this arrangement, it legitimized it, protected it, celebrated it as free enterprise. The political factions within the Senate made the structural bias explicit. The core faction emerged as a permanent bloc that consistently advocated for centralized government power and higher taxes, with one explicit goal: forcing the rest of the galaxy to serve the economic interests of the core worlds. They didn't hide it. They didn't pretend that the Outer Rim's contributions would be reciprocated with investment or protection. The core faction operated from a simple premise: the galaxy existed to feed Coruscant. Any pretense otherwise was diplomatic theater. So when you hear that half the galaxy eventually sided with a separatist movement, don't act surprised. The groundwork was laid before the first Senate chamber was even constructed. But the moment that locked in the Outer Rim's permanent subordination, the moment that made everything that followed inevitable, came in 1000 BBY. The rousan reformation. History books celebrate it as a triumph of reform, a restructuring after the catastrophic New Sith Wars, a commitment to the Republic's founding ideals. It was nothing of the sort. The rousan reformation reorganized the galaxy into 1024 regional sectors. On the surface, this appeared to distribute power away from Coruscant and toward local governance. The regional approach suggested the Republic was finally listening to outlying territories, finally acknowledging that a single legislative body on a single planet couldn't adequately govern millions of inhabited worlds. But the reform contained a poison pill. Prominent core worlds were allowed to maintain independent Senate representation. They bypassed the regional structure entirely, preserved their direct line to power, while Outer Rim territories were folded into regional blocks where their voices could be diluted and their concerns averaged away. Wealthy core planets continued to speak with individual authority. The reform wasn't a distribution of power. It was a consolidation disguised as decentralization. And the military provisions delivered the final blow. The Republic military was disbanded entirely. Defense responsibilities shifted to planetary security forces, operating under strict regulations that limited their size and capability. The stated rationale was demilitarization, a commitment to the peaceful ideals that had supposedly animated the Republic's founding. The practical effect? A security architecture that worked perfectly for wealthy core worlds and catastrophically for everyone else. Core planets, with their vast tax bases and industrial capacities, could maintain planetary security forces that pushed against the regulatory limits. They fielded larger capital ships, more professional personnel, through legal loopholes that only money could access. Outer Rim worlds, lacking the funds to maintain even adequate defenses, were left with what the sources describe as older, smaller ships that made them highly vulnerable to pirates and slavers. The Reformation's architects must have understood what they were creating. By eliminating the Republic military, they removed the only institution capable of projecting force to the galactic periphery. By allowing core worlds to maintain superior defenses while restricting Outer Rim capabilities, they created a security disparity so vast it became self-reinforcing. Slavers understood the math. Raiding a core world meant facing professional security forces equipped with modern warships. Raiding an Outer Rim farming colony meant facing whatever defense the locals could scrape together from spare parts and salvage. The Republic didn't need to actively encourage slavery in the Outer Rim. It just needed to ensure the outer rim couldn't defend itself, then look away while market forces did the rest. This is how you run an extraction regime while keeping your hands clean. You don't pass legislation authorizing slavery, you just defund the military that would stop it. You don't officially endorse piracy, you just structure the security apparatus so that only wealthy worlds can afford protection. Then you sit in your floating Senate platform, hovering at equal height with your peers, and deplore the lawlessness on the frontier that you deliberately created. The Reformation's demilitarization provisions weren't a commitment to peace. They were an outsourcing of violence to private actors who would do the dirty work of labor extraction while the Senate's conscience remained untroubled. Then came the financial trap. Outer rim systems that lacked funds for basic infrastructure, spaceports, communication networks, medical facilities, found themselves forced into arrangements with the intergalactic banking clan. High-interest loans turned struggling worlds into permanent debt-trapped client states. Their resources flowed outward to service payments to mune bankers. Their populations watched living standards decline, while credits vanished into interest payments. The banking clan's loans weren't charity. They were instruments of control. Here's how the trap worked. A world that needed capital for development found that its only option was borrowing from moon bankers at interest rates that guaranteed permanent indebtedness. The loans came with conditions that gave the banking clan influence over planetary policy, conditions that ensured borrowed credits would flow outward to core world suppliers and financial institutions rather than building local capacity. Take a world that needed a spaceport. It takes a banking clan loan to build one. But the loan terms require purchasing materials from core world manufacturers at premium prices, hiring core world contractors at inflated rates, repaying principal in a currency that requires selling commodities at whatever price core world buyers offer. The spaceport gets built. Development goal technically fulfilled, but the planetary economy ends the process worse off than it started, now owing more to the banking clan, having created no local industrial capacity, no local expertise, no foundation for future growth, just debt. A planet that owed its entire gross planetary product to creditors on Munilinst had no leverage in Senate debates, no ability to fund defensive infrastructure, no pathway to economic independence. Debt became a mechanism of control more effective than any military occupation. The banking clan didn't need to station troops on outer rim worlds. It just needed to structure loans that guaranteed those worlds would be making payments forever. And the Senate? The Senate let the banking clan conduct this systematic impoverishment. The same Senate that had already granted the Trade Federation a voting seat alongside planetary delegations. Let me tell you about the Alsacan conflicts, because they reveal something the Republic's defenders would rather forget. These conflicts, 17 distinct wars, were fought over the course of 14,000 years. Not between the Republic and some external threat, between Coruscant and the planet Alsacan. For a prize that illuminates the Republic's true nature, the right to be the capital, the right to control the flow of resources from the galactic periphery. 17 wars, 14,000 years. The Republic fought longer over which core world would dominate the extraction regime than most civilizations exist. And when the fighting finally ended, Coruscant emerged victorious. Its position at the center of galactic governance secured not through constitutional principle, not through democratic mandate, through the accumulated weight of military victory. The Outer Rim watched from afar as two privileged systems slaughtered each other for the right to steal from everyone else. The core world's hunger for resources grew more ravenous as the millennia passed. The sources describe core planets becoming ravenous for the raw materials their industrial economies required, embarking on aggressive colonization campaigns that treated the Outer Rim as a supply depot rather than a collection of societies with their own aspirations and governance. The extraction wasn't subtle. Planets like Eriadu were valued primarily for their lomite ore. Their contributions to galactic civilization measured in tonnage rather than culture. Mining operations carved into Outer Rim worlds like parasites into host tissue, extracting everything of value while leaving behind populations with contaminated water tables, exhausted soil, economies wholly dependent on exports to a core that set prices unilaterally. When the resources were exhausted, the mining corporations moved on. Left behind populations with no economic base, no representation capable of securing reconstruction funding. The landscape of a depleted mining world told the story that no Senate debate ever would. Mountains reduced to craters, rivers running with industrial waste, settlements built for extraction and abandoned when extraction ended, ghost towns on worlds that the Republic had used up and thrown away. The labor flows that resulted from this economic architecture concentrated wealth in the galactic center. Young people from outer rim worlds who wanted education or economic opportunity had to migrate toward the core, where universities and industries clustered. This brain drain meant the rim's most talented individuals contributed their productive years to core economies, while their homeworlds bore the costs of raising and educating them without receiving any return on that investment. Some migrants eventually returned home. Many stayed in the core, established families and careers that reinforced the center's advantages. The Republic's official position celebrated freedom of movement. The practical effect was a systematic transfer of human potential from periphery to center that continued for millennia. The outer rim raised its children. Coruscant consumed their labor. And the security vacuum created by the rousan reformation left the outer rim's remaining populations exposed to predation the Republic could have stopped, but chose not to. Criminal syndicates operated throughout outer rim territories with effective impunity. They understood that no Republic force existed to challenge them, that planetary security forces in these regions were too small and too poorly equipped to pose a threat. Slavery flourished in this environment. Human and alien populations captured and sold through networks connecting the lawless rim to buyers across the galaxy. The Senate occasionally debated anti-slavery resolutions, but without a military capable of enforcement, these debates produced nothing but rhetoric. The Republic's position amounted to a statement. Slavery was officially deplored, but unofficially tolerated. Citizens of outer rim worlds were theoretically protected by galactic law, but practically abandoned to whatever fate the market assigned them. A child stolen from an outer rim settlement and sold into bondage was a victim of Republic policy, as surely as if the Senate had passed legislation authorizing the transaction. The Republic didn't need to sign the slave contract. It just needed to defund the military that would have stopped the slavers, then express concern in committee hearings while changing nothing. Which brings us to the evidence that the Republic's failures weren't circumstantial, that no reform could fix what was broken, that the system was working exactly as designed, and anyone who thought otherwise was either naive or complicit. The High Republic era. Centered around 232 BBY, Supreme Chancellor Lina So launches what becomes known as the Great Works Initiative, an ambitious program designed specifically to address the Outer Rim's legitimate grievances. The centerpiece? The Starlight Beacon, a massive space station positioned at the edge of known space as a symbol of the Republic's commitment to its outlying territories. Genuine investment in infrastructure, visible presence in neglected regions, a practical demonstration that the Senate cared about more than extraction. Chancellor So appeared to understand that the Republic's legitimacy depended on extending its benefits beyond the core. She was right. The Great Works Initiative failed anyway, and its failure illuminates why reform within the Republic's existing architecture was essentially impossible. The oligarchic structures that had accumulated over millennia proved more durable than any chancellor's vision. Core world senators, who had built their political careers on direct access to power, weren't about to surrender that advantage for the sake of principles their constituents had never shared. The Great Works Initiative failed. The Starlight Beacon became a monument to the Republic's structural limitations rather than a catalyst for change. The Outer Rim returned to its familiar status as the galaxy's afterthought, and the pattern that had repeated for 24,000 years, crisis, reform attempt, reversion to extraction, continued unbroken. This is where the tragic inevitability becomes impossible to deny. 24 millennia. How many times did someone try to fix this? How many chancellors launched initiatives? How many senators gave speeches about bringing the Republic's benefits to all its citizens? How many reform movements rose, made noise, achieved nothing, and faded into historical footnotes? The Republic wasn't failing because of bad actors. It was failing because its architecture was designed for extraction, and every attempt to repurpose that architecture for equity ran headlong into the accumulated weight of 24,000 years of core world dominance. You can't reform a system that's working exactly as intended. The Outer Rim's experience wasn't a bug, it was the feature. So when Count Dooku started making speeches about the Republic's corruption, about the Senate's capture by corporate interests, about the Outer Rim's systematic exploitation, he wasn't lying. That's what made him dangerous. Let me be clear about something. This isn't a defense of Dooku. The separatist movement was ultimately a Sith conspiracy, its leadership manipulated by the same forces that controlled the Republic. But the existence of that movement, the fact that half the galaxy sided with it, is evidence. The most damning evidence possible. Half the galaxy. Thousands of systems looked at the choice between staying in the Republic and joining a rebellion led by a former Jedi who might have been a madman, and they chose the madman. That doesn't happen because populations are stupid. That doesn't happen because of propaganda or manipulation. That happens because the Republic had spent 24,000 years giving the Outer Rim every reason to leave and no reason to stay. The separatist movement succeeded in recruiting half the galaxy because its recruitment pitch was simple. The Republic took everything from you and gave nothing back. And the Republic couldn't counter that pitch, because it was true. Think about what it takes to convince a planetary government to secede. These weren't impulsive decisions. They were calculated choices made by leaders who understood they'd be targets of whatever military response the Republic eventually mounted. Leaders who knew their worlds might be blockaded, invaded, destroyed. They chose rebellion anyway. Because staying meant continuing to pay taxes to a government that wouldn't protect them from slavers. Continuing to watch their resources flow toward a core that considered them expendable. Continuing to send their children to die of poverty or migration, while Coruscant's upper levels glittered with stolen wealth. The Republic acted shocked when the Outer Rim rebelled. 24,000 years of receipts, and they acted shocked. Senators who had voted for every military restriction that left Rim worlds defenseless. Senators who had welcomed the Trade Federation as a colleague. Senators who had approved banking clan lending practices that trapped entire systems in permanent debt. These senators stood in their floating platforms and expressed bewilderment that anyone would want to leave this magnificent democratic experiment. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. But it was also strategic. Because admitting that the separatist movement had legitimate grievances would mean admitting that the Republic bore responsibility for creating those grievances. Would mean acknowledging that the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, and the design was extraction. Easier to blame Dooku. Blame Sith influence. Blame ignorant Rim populations who couldn't appreciate the benefits of galactic civilization. Blame anyone except the institutions that had spent 24 millennia building a galaxy where half of it had every rational reason to rebel. Here's the thing about Palpatine that the conventional narrative gets wrong. The conventional narrative says Palpatine destroyed the Republic, corrupted a good institution, turned democracy into dictatorship. That's not what happened. Palpatine didn't destroy something good. He recognized what was already dead and claimed the body. The Republic was a corpse before Palpatine killed it. He just made it official, gave the corpse a new name, changed the branding from Republic to Empire, while leaving the underlying architecture of extraction completely intact. The vertical hierarchy of Coruscant? Still there. The Trade Federation's influence over commerce? Still there. The banking clan's debt traps? Still there. The Outer Rim's exposure to exploitation and violence? Still there. Palpatine's genius wasn't in creating a new system. It was in recognizing that the old system had been an empire all along. just one that wasted energy maintaining the pretense of democracy. He streamlined the operation, cut out the middleman of Senate debates that produced nothing but rhetoric, made explicit what had always been implicit. The Outer Rim populations didn't experience much change when the Republic became the Empire. Their taxes still flowed toward the galactic center. Their resources still fed core world industries. Their children were still vulnerable to exploitation by whatever force held local power. The floating Senate platforms that had symbolized democratic equality, they kept floating. The same senators kept sitting in them. The same votes kept passing. The extraction continued. If the Republic had been what it claimed to be, its transformation into the Empire would have been a traumatic rupture. Populations would have rebelled against the loss of rights they'd actually possessed. Instead, the transition was almost seamless, because most of the galaxy had never possessed those rights in the first place. The Outer Rim had been living under imperial conditions since before the Empire existed. 24,000 years of history, and the pattern never broke. Crisis after crisis, reformation after reformation, chancellor after chancellor, and every single time the result was the same. Core world dominance preserved. Outer Rim exploitation continued. Democratic theater maintained, while oligarchic reality persisted. The cyclical nature of these failures resembled nothing so much as Sisyphus on a galactic scale. The boulder rolled up the hill. The boulder rolled back down. Again and again, for 24 millennia, with entire civilizations caught beneath it each time it fell. But Sisyphus was punished for defying the gods. The Republic's endless cycling wasn't punishment. It was design. The boulder was supposed to roll back down. The reforms were supposed to fail. The extraction was supposed to continue. That's what makes this tragic, rather than simply villainous. There's no single bad actor to blame. No moment where someone could have made a different choice and changed the outcome. The Republic's founding architecture ensured that resources would flow toward the center and away from the periphery. Every institution built on that architecture inherited that logic. Every reform that tried to reverse that flow encountered 24,000 years of accumulated structural resistance. The Republic wasn't corrupted. It was working perfectly. And the populations of the Outer Rim understood this, even if historians rarely acknowledge it. They watched the Senate debates. They saw the rhetoric about democratic equality. They observed the floating platforms hovering at equal height. Then they looked at their depleted mining worlds, their vulnerability to slavers, their children leaving for core world opportunities that would never be available at home. They drew the obvious conclusion. The rebellion wasn't a betrayal of the Republic's ideals. It was the only rational response to a system that had never included them. The separatist movement didn't fail because its grievances were illegitimate. It failed because it was compromised by Sith manipulation from the beginning. Manipulation that ensured the movement would discredit itself, rather than achieve actual independence. But the grievances survived. The exploitation continued. Because the architecture never changed. Coruscant was still Coruscant. The core worlds still dominated. The Outer Rim was still a collection of populations to be governed, rather than represented. That's the final piece of evidence in this case. The fact that every era of the Republic, the founding era, the post-Rousan Republic, the High Republic, the prequel-era Republic, confronted the same structural dynamics and failed to resolve them. The problem wasn't the leadership, wasn't the historical moment, wasn't the specific policies adopted or rejected. The problem was the architecture. A galaxy organized around a single dominant center will always extract from its periphery. A Senate that includes corporate members alongside planetary representatives will always prioritize profit over citizens. A military structure that allows wealthy worlds to maintain superior defenses will always leave poor worlds vulnerable. A financial system controlled by lenders who benefit from permanent indebtedness will always trap borrowers in permanent indebtedness. These aren't accidents, they're features. And features persist because someone benefits from them. The core worlds benefited. The Trade Federation benefited. The banking clan benefited. Every institution with a stake in the Republic's existing structure benefited from maintaining that structure, and their combined weight overwhelmed every reform movement that ever tried to change it. The Outer Rim Rebellion was inevitable, not because the populations who joined it were irrational or manipulated, because the Republic had spent 24,000 years ensuring they had nothing to lose. When you take everything from a population, resources, taxes, labor, security, hope, and give nothing back, that population will eventually rebel. The only question is timing. The separatist crisis provided the moment, but the momentum had been building for millennia. And when the rebellion came, the Republic's response revealed everything. Instead of acknowledging its failures and negotiating reforms that might have addressed legitimate grievances, the Republic received a clone army from unknown origins, fought a war where the populations caught in the crossfire, on both sides, became collateral damage in a conflict between elites, destroyed the separatist movement without destroying the conditions that had created it, then expressed shock when Palpatine consolidated power, then expressed shock when the Empire emerged, then expressed shock when the Outer Rim remained restive and resistant to central authority. The Republic never understood what it was. Or maybe it understood perfectly, and the rhetoric about democracy was always deliberate deception. Either way, the result was the same: a galaxy organized for extraction, governed by oligarchy, and defended by a military that protected the center while abandoning the periphery. The architecture proves the lie. Coruscant's vertical hierarchy, with wealth literally rising above poverty. The Senate chamber's equal floating platforms, masking a voting structure dominated by core world interests and corporate members. The rousan reformation's regional sectors, creating the illusion of decentralization while preserving core world privilege. The Trade Federation's free trade zones, turning commerce into extraction. The banking clan's loans, turning development into debt. The planetary security forces, leaving the Outer Rim defenseless by design. Every physical structure, every institutional arrangement, every legal framework, all pointing in the same direction. Resources flowing from periphery to center, power concentrated in the hands of those who already possessed it, and 24,000 years of evidence that nothing would ever change. The Republic took everything from the Outer Rim, then acted shocked when it rebelled. But the shock was performance. The Republic's architects knew exactly what they were building, and they built it to last 24,000 years. It did. Subscribe for more stories like this.